Thank you so much, Johan.
Thanks, Joe. Great. Good morning. It's so good to be with you. Nice to be in Johannesburg. It's the nicest time of the year. It's beautiful. The city is beautiful. The people are beautiful. So really, really great to be with you. And to share with you something of what we've experienced in the last while. And there's so much you can say about Singapore, but I'll try and keep it relevant to what I believe is lessons that's relevant for us and that we can learn. I'm passionate about technology since I can remember, and using technology to solve problems. At the moment, we're busy with robotics, integration of renewable energy, driving e-mobility across Southeast Asia, building data centers and all sorts of things, and try and do that on a sustainable way, try and drive productivity growth that drives economic growth through that. But I'll tell you, if that's exciting, it's infinitely more exciting to place that in God's hands and to build His kingdom with what He's given you and the opportunities that He has given you. And it's incredible to see God's bigger plan and to see His daily interaction as we do this. I really, it's the testimony of my life that Acts 17 verse 26 is true, that God has truly placed His people in specific places, in specific seasons, so that people may seek Him. And that's exactly the testimony of my life. We are definitely not in Singapore by accident. I'm not there because of my job. I'm not there to earn some income. God spoke to me so clearly about serving Him in business and in that specific location in the season of our lives. And I believe that is what every single one of you should be sure of, is that you are sure of that call of God. That is a crystal clear purpose to your life and the difference that you make through what you do every single day, every ordinary day. So Singapore. So what I've chosen to say, I'm going to share with you something about the Singapore story, just the miracle that happened in Singapore over a fairly short space of time, and then something about this Committee for Future Economy and how that forum worked, and then something more about my own testimony. So that's where Singapore is, if you don't know. A small little red dot, 750 square kilometers. It'll easily fit inside Johannesburg. About 6 million people that live there today. So the start of Singapore. In 1965, you saw the headlines of the newspapers. I think this specific one that's quoted there, hundreds dead in the streets, mobs were ruling, a lot of gangster violence, and it was so bad that Malaysia expelled Singapore. They voted to expel Singapore. So how incredible is that the country became independent because they were unwanted. The situation was so bad because of racial tensions and just absolute chaos ruling on the streets there. And so that was the beginning of Singapore, and the people came together. There was strong, good leadership, and decided they're going to change this, and they want a different future, and they started to build a new Singapore. And 50 years later, Singapore is an incredible success story. It is, you can pick a ranking that matters, and Singapore will be in the top 10 somehow. I've put some of the rankings up there. It's the safest city for raising children. It's, at the moment, the easiest place to do business. It's ranked as the most ready for technology adoption. They've got, I don't want to rub this in, but they've got the most reliable electricity grid in the world. If you live in Singapore, you lose 12 seconds of power supply a year on average. It's 3 times better than the next best one, which is Germany. And I won't compare that with the situation here at the moment, but it's possible. 3rd most competitive economy in the world, 3rd most innovative economy in the world, 3rd longest life expectancy, something that's also dramatically changed. And there were years where they added a year of life expectancy every year because of the increases in quality of healthcare and lifestyle. So an incredible story. And all of that happened in 50 years. And if you look at this amazing chart just of per capita GDP, so GDP divided by the number of people in the country, you see where Singapore started, this little red line down here, very average and going nowhere, and how it's overtaken in years big economies like Japan, Hong Kong, the US, and is at the moment the 3rd highest per capita GDP in the world. So it can happen. It's absolutely possible. There were absolutely no natural resources in Singapore. The only thing that they inherited from colonial rule was a port And they started with that and started building that and started to drive some economic growth through the port. And today, I think it's still the world's second busiest port, doing about 65 million TEUs a year of cargo through that port. And yeah, so it is possible. It can be done. So the Committee for the Future Economy. This story of Singapore sounds amazing, and when you've got all these incredible statistics, it sounds like, okay, it couldn't get better. The problem in Singapore is in the last 10 years, they haven't been able to sustain that pace of growth, and expectations are high. And one very easy thing to understand is productivity growth becomes very, very difficult once you reach those kinds of levels of per capita GDP. So they've had no productivity growth in the last 10 years, and that's very difficult to keep people's lives improving and keep the economy growing. So one of the actions that the government took is to initiate this Committee for Future Economy, and their fundamental thinking was, we've got to get the best brains together at a table and work out how do we drive the economy going forward, and they're looking 10 to 30 years ahead. And taking consideration of what happens in their neighborhood, what's happening in the world, what's happening in the world of technology, what are the needs of our people, and how do we continue to make sure that there's a competitive advantage for that small little country. So the minister convened the main committee, and they set up 7 subcommittees that focused on specific aspects. The committee that I was part of covered new industries or growth industries and growth markets. So which markets to work with for imports and exports, for foreign direct investment, and which industries to target. And that's one of the interesting things there is they said no to as many options as they said yes to. So very clear in choosing where do we have a competitive advantage. So this committee was kicked off at the end of 2016. It consisted of some government officials, some of the state-owned entities like the Economic Development Board, and then educators, people from business schools, business executives and leaders, people from NGOs, and all sitting together at the table. So each of these subcommittees had 15 people in, and we met, I think, about 10 times formally for a whole afternoon with really deep conversation, really robust, strong conversation. A lot of good preparation went into it, so there was always a pack of pre-reading, maybe, I don't know, 200, 250 pages of things to study, and so a good research background and input. And that was prepared by committee members, our companies, we sat together. So there's a lot of work that happened in the background. So a great process, and a process that unleashed a lot of passion, it unleashed a lot of ownership. And the very interesting outcome of this is that everybody that was part of that process is now totally committed to make sure this gets implemented. So there's a whole set of committees. For example, I'm on one leading advanced manufacturing. So we still meet every 2 months and look at and check how are we going with implementing these strategies that we came up with, and what are the obstacles, how do we overcome them. One of the cornerstones of this whole program was education. So what Singapore realized is because there's so little natural resources, people are the biggest resource that they've got, and that's where you've got to make the investment. So they make an enormous effort of making sure people are included, that everybody gets an opportunity to get skills developed that are relevant for the future and that fits the direction in which they're driving the economy, realizing that you can't go there if you don't have people to take you there. So yeah, very, very interesting process. And I thought, if you could get something like that going at a city level where people really could come to the table with their best ideas, their best creative options, you've got to do that with a well-prepared framework within which you do that, so that you don't end up having endless debates about ideologies at that table. I think you've got to have a fairly clear mandate of what do we want to do and what are the guardrails of the process. And then you can have everyone putting the best of what they've got into that process. And it was an absolute privilege to be part of that. Relationships were built around those tables, and some of my best friends in Singapore are now some of the guys that I've met at those, in those committees. We did a lot of work outside. Each of the committee members then had to go and run some workshops. Let's say one of the workshops I ran was around renewable power use in the city. So we got everybody who's got anything to say and ran series of workshops. Well facilitated again. The government provided some resources to help arrange these, and where we got inputs as wide and as far as possible, and then distilled that and brought that back into the committee to shape and form these plans. So even beyond the committee members, there was a lot of buy-in and a lot of people included. I think about 9,000 people out of the business environment that was included in that process. So, just my story and my testimony, because that's one of the lessons I can share with you from Singapore. It's not Singaporean, but South African in Singapore. But what Ian spoke about business people and pastors and how we are part of the church, I can really say I've lived that. It is incredible when you partner with Jesus. And I have a weekly testimony of God speaking to me about small details of my job, about how to handle people's situations, how to, what I've realized is sometimes the best input you can give is to ask the right question and just prompting by the Holy Spirit. And so much of it comes from what I've heard in the church preached the Sunday before. It's just incredible how that meets exactly what I'm doing somewhere in the week ahead. So in some ways, this partnership between pastors and business people and how we drive and build the kingdom is just the normal thing of going to church and really building into the church. And I found this cycle of getting something from just my participation in church, someone else's testimony, something that was preached, something that we prayed about in the prayer meeting that's irrelevant, getting reminded of that in the week, somehow starting to make a difference. It brings success and good outcomes. I don't know how many times my boss has said to me, why didn't I think of that? Obvious stuff that I can honestly say is just coming from God. And then going back to church and sharing a testimony or helping equip other people. And then this cycle just repeats. We become stronger at church at equipping and preparing people for living out their faith in the workplace. And I think if we can then come together and really sit together around a table as Christian people, the people of God, how much stronger will that be? So that's just absolutely my story, that it is the most exciting, most thrilling thing to be in the church, getting resourced and equipped there, and then through success in business, tithes flow back in the church, that resources the work of the kingdom, and that cycle just repeats and gets stronger and stronger. And it is absolutely my prayer that that would be true in this church and in the city of Johannesburg, and that we would see that more and more, and that it would bless the city. We would see Jesus get all the glory from what comes from that. Maybe just one more thought to add. Is that alone, economic growth alone, all these wonderful statistics that you saw of Singapore, that doesn't necessarily bring glory to Jesus. You've got to live your testimony. You've got to keep proclaiming that Jesus is the only way. And the wonderful thing is when you're running your business in a way, in God's way, when you truly choose God's way, when you stand up for what's right, for what's just, even when, and it often happens, in business, especially in large corporate global businesses, global policies don't always consider individual people. They don't care about people. And if you'd stand up for that, you will see that there's respect and suddenly your testimony has credibility. Suddenly people are interested to hear what you believe and what you stand for. So that's this amazing, amazing story of partnering with God, I think, and doing that in business. So that's what I've got to share with you this morning.
Wonderful. Thank you. Can we appreciate Johan?